Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Don Rickles, the most feared mouth in American show business, is about to walk out onto the Tonight Show stage. And what he does in the next 3 minutes will make Johnny Carson grip the edge of his desk so hard his knuckles go white. It will make Ed McMahon press both hands over his face. It will silence 300 people who came to laugh. And it will reveal a secret buried so deep, for so long, that even the man sitting across from Rickles had no idea it was coming. A secret so extraordinary that when it finally came out on live national television, it didn't just change what America knew about the world's most famous insult comedian. It changed what America understood about friendship itself, about loyalty, about the things we do for the people we love in the dark, without telling them, without asking for anything in return. But before we go 1 second further, I need you to understand something that will make everything that follows hit the way it needs to hit. Don Rickles was not supposed to have this career. He was not supposed to be a legend, not supposed to be the man who made Frank Sinatra beg for mercy, who made Bob Hope double over, who made the entire population of Las Vegas understand that being singled out by Don Rickles in a showroom was the highest honor the city could offer. He was not supposed to be the performer who could walk into any room in America, look at the first face he saw, and say something so precisely, so devastatingly, so lovingly accurate, that the room would gasp before it laughed. Because 20 years before that night on the Tonight Show stage, on a cold Tuesday evening in October of 1958, Don Rickles had made a decision. He was done with comedy, done with the clubs, done with the auditions that went nowhere, and the agents who returned other people's calls first, and the managers who kept telling him to be more likable, more of whatever it was the industry wanted. Done with the humiliation of giving everything he had to rooms that didn't understand what he was offering. He had written the letter, he had made the call, he was walking away from the only thing he had ever wanted to do with his life. What stopped him was not ambition, not stubbornness, not the fire in his belly that every biography would later describe. What stopped Don Rickles was one man, one act of quiet, invisible kindness that Rickles would carry for 20 years without knowing its full dimensions, without knowing how deep it went, without knowing that the single moment that kept him in show business had been followed by years of something even more extraordinary. All of it done in silence, all of it invisible, never once brought up between two men who would become the closest friends in the business. And when he finally discovered the truth, when a 14-page document fell into his hands in a backstage corridor 40 minutes before a live broadcast, Don Rickles did the only thing left to do. He went on television. He sat down across from Johnny Carson, and for the first time in his life, the man who had insulted presidents and kings had absolutely nothing funny to say. Wait, stay here, because what you are about to hear is not the story you think it is. Not yet. October 14th, 1958. The Fontainebleau Hotel, Miami Beach, Florida. Donald J. Rickles was 32 years old, stocky, balding, possessed of a face that, as he himself frequently noted, not even his mother had found entirely convincing. He had been grinding through the lounge circuit for 7 years. 7 years of clubs where the smell of cigarettes soaked into your jacket and stayed there. 7 years of auditions that went nowhere. 7 years of managers telling him to be more likable, more accessible, more of whatever the industry wanted. The problem was that Don Rickles didn't know how to be less. He only knew how to be more. The act he had developed was unlike anything else in American comedy. He didn't tell jokes. He responded. He looked at a face in the audience and said something about that specific person, that specific moment, and the truth of it was so undeniable that the laughter it produced was less like the appreciation of a clever construction and more like the startled recognition of being seen. He wasn't insulting people, he was seeing them, and most people desperately wanted to be seen, even if the seeing came wrapped in a joke at their expense. But the industry in 1958 called him dangerous. Not in the way that would eventually make him a legend, but in the way that made booking agents nervous and television executives look elsewhere. Too unpredictable, too hard to contain. And after 7 years of being told he was too much, Don Rickles had finally started to believe it. His manager, Joe Scandor, had worked the phones for months to get the Fontainebleau booking. This was the verdict. And if Don could hold this room, 300 people in formal dress with real expectations, everything changed. If he couldn't, everything also changed. In the other direction. He bombed. Completely. Catastrophically. With a thoroughness that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so devastating. The audience sat in polite, expensive, well-dressed silence while Don worked the room. The material that had killed in the Cleveland clubs and the Chicago lounges lay flat on the white linen tablecloths and didn't move. A few uncomfortable laughs from the tables near the back, the sympathetic ones, the people who could feel what was happening and wanted to make it easier without knowing how. A few pity chuckles from a table on the left where 2 couples had been drinking since 7 and would have laughed at almost anything. And then, from somewhere near the center of the room, the sound that lives in every working comedian's nightmares. A man, clearly and completely bored, turning to the waiter and loudly ordering another round of drinks. In the middle of Don's set, not at the end, not in a pause, in the middle of a sentence. Don finished his 40 minutes. Every second felt like an hour. He walked off through the side exit and sat in the narrow service corridor with his jacket off and draped over a metal chair, his tie loosened, and the absolute silence of a man who has just confirmed something he had been afraid to face for 7 years. Done. Not in the way he had said it before, those nights on earlier tours when the show hadn't gone well, and he'd gone back to his hotel room and set it to the ceiling, and woken up the next morning with the stubbornness still intact. This was different. This was the final accounting. He had gotten the room, the real room, the room that was supposed to change everything. He had stood in it and given everything he had, and the room had not moved. Tomorrow morning, he would call Joe. He was going to make it clean and simple. He was 32 years old, and it was over, and he was going to go back to New York and find something, anything else to do with his life. He sat in that corridor for 25 minutes. Then somebody knocked on the door. Don considered not answering. Anyone coming to this corridor after a performance like that was either going to say something kind and useless or something true and worse. He opened the door. The man standing there was young. 29, maybe. Lean, well put together, with a kind of careful tidiness that suggested someone who had grown up without money. He had an easy, open face and very direct eyes, and he was nobody. Don recognized. "We're closed," Don said. "I know," the young man said. He didn't move. "I just wanted to tell you something before you decided whatever you're about to decide." Don stared at him. "What makes you think I'm about to decide anything?" "Because you've been in this corridor for 25 minutes and you're still wearing your stage clothes." Don said nothing. "I was in the room tonight," the young man said. "The whole set. And I need you to hear something as a true thing, not a kind thing, because I think you know the difference." He paused. "You were the funniest person I have seen in 10 years of watching comedy." Don stared. "The audience was wrong tonight," the young man said. "Not you. They weren't ready for what you were doing. That is not the same thing as what you were doing being wrong." Silence. The music from the showroom filtered through the walls. The next act, something soft and inoffensive. Exactly what the Fontainebleau wanted. "Who are you?" Don said. "Johnny Carson. I do a show on daytime television. Nothing you'd have seen. but I've watched a lot of comedy, and I know what I'm looking at." He extended his hand. "The room will catch up to you. Rooms always catch up eventually. But you have to stay in the game long enough for that to happen." He said, "Good night." He turned and walked back down the corridor. He turned the corner and was gone. Don Rickles stood in the service corridor for another 5 minutes. Then he picked up his jacket. He put it on. He straightened his tie. He did not call Joe Scandor the next morning. He went back out on the Fontainebleau stage the following night. The show didn't go much better, but the decision had already been unmade, and what happened on stage the second night was something he could survive. He stayed in the game. What he could not have known, standing in that corridor at midnight in Miami Beach, was that the young man who had just talked him back into his own career had not finished. Not by a long way, not by 20 years. But wait, do not miss this detail, because what you have seen so far is only the first layer of this story. Within 8 months of the Fontainebleau, Don Rickles had his first significant television booking, then another, then a Chicago club engagement, then a Las Vegas showcase. Often, Don's manager couldn't understand it. His agent couldn't understand it. Don himself couldn't understand it. It was as if a door had been quietly unlocked somewhere in the machinery of show business, and every room that had been closed was suddenly open. He didn't question it. Comedians don't question momentum. They ride it. By 1965, he was a star. By 1970, a legend. By 1975, the undisputed king of Las Vegas. Frank Sinatra called him the only person in the world who can insult me and make me love him for it. He appeared on every talk show, every variety special, every room that mattered. And through all of it, Johnny Carson remained his closest friend in show business. Their friendship was famous, warm, genuine, in the way that very few relationships in Hollywood ever managed to be. Their Tonight Show appearances together were events. Don would walk out and immediately begin the demolition. Johnny's suits, which Don described as the kind of garment a man wore when he had given up on the concept of taste entirely. His ex-wives, each of whom Don treated as an ongoing national news story requiring regular editorial updates. His Nebraska origins, his golf game, his laugh, his haircut, his pencil, the way he held his coffee mug. Nothing was safe. Nothing too small. And Johnny would sit there grinning with the warm equanimity of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. And the audience would watch two people who clearly adored each other express that adoration in the only language available to men of their generation, which was the language of affectionate and precise combat. Nobody watching those appearances ever saw what was underneath. Nobody saw what was actually holding that friendship together at its foundation, which was not just affection and not just history, but something rarer and harder to name. Something that had to do with one man having decided 20 years earlier to see another man clearly and then act on what he saw without asking for anything in return. Nobody saw the 20 years of phone calls. Nobody knew that every door that had opened for Don Rickles in those critical early years had been preceded by a quiet, casual, entirely natural-sounding call from a man whose name every relevant person in American entertainment recognized and trusted. Have you seen this guy? Don Rickles, from New York? He's the funniest person in any room he walks into. You should give him a chance. Not a formal recommendation, not a favor being called in. Just a phone call between two professionals, the kind made 50 times a day in the industry and forgotten the moment both parties hang up. Except that Johnny Carson had been making these calls since December of 1958, systematically, without ever mentioning them to Don, without ever creating a debt, without ever doing anything that might have made Don feel that his success was something other than his own. Johnny had kept a record, not for use at a later date, not as leverage, but simply because he was the kind of man who kept records of things that mattered to him, and what was happening to Don Rickles' career had mattered to him since a midnight conversation in a Miami Beach corridor in 1958. The record was 14 pages long, and on the evening of November 11, 1978, through a researcher's filing error and a misdelivered folder, it ended up in the wrong green room. Don Rickles arrived at NBC Studio One at 4:40 p.m. He was always early. Often, he sat in the green room with his coffee and picked up the folder left on the table. He assumed it was production materials. He opened it. He read the first page, then the second, then the third. He stopped. He went back to the first page and read it again from the beginning, more slowly, with the complete, arrested attention of a man whose understanding of the last 20 years of his life is reorganizing itself in real time. The document was a call log in Johnny Carson's handwriting. Harold Bernstein, Chicago. December 1958. Mentioned Rickles for spring dates. Bill Miller, The Sahara, March 1959. Suggested for summer showcase. Pete Barnum, CBS Development, June 1959. Mentioned for Variety Slot Review. Bobby Fine, Copa, January 1962. Told him Rickles was ready for a major room. And on, and on, and on. 20 years of names, 20 years of dates, every category of the entertainment industry. Club owners, television producers, network executives, Las Vegas entertainment directors. Every name on those pages was a door. Every date was a call. Every door had opened. Don sat in that green room for 11 minutes without moving. When Ed McMahon walked past on his way to the coffee machine, he stopped. He had known Don Rickles in every professional and personal context for 30 years. He had never seen this particular stillness. "Don, what is that?" Don looked up. His face was chalk. "Where did this come from?" Don said. Ed crossed the room and read 4 lines. His expression changed. "Don," he said quietly, "did you not know any of this?" Don held the document against his chest. The voice that had commanded every room in America was barely above a whisper. "I never knew," he said. "Not one name, not one call. He never told me, Ed, not once in 20 years. Ed McMahon stood in the green room without speaking. Through the wall, he could hear the studio audience filling their seats. The cameras would be live in 28 minutes. Don folded the document carefully. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He pressed his hand flat against his chest for a moment. "I need to talk to him," Don said. What was said in Johnny Carson's dressing room during the next 16 minutes, nobody fully disclosed. The stage manager knocked twice. Both times Johnny's voice came through the closed door with the same 4 words. "Give us a minute." Nobody on the Tonight Show crew had ever heard Johnny Carson ask for more time before a broadcast. Not once, not in 15 years. When Don walked out, his eyes were dry and his face was composed. He looked at the stage manager and said, in a voice so professionally normal, it was almost surreal, "Let's go." The show began at 5:30 p.m. Exactly. Johnny's monologue was flawless. From the control room, it looked like any other Tuesday. Ed McMahon was watching Johnny's hands on the desk throughout, the hands of a man performing while also bracing. At 6:22 p.m., Ed's voice filled Studio One. "Ladies and gentlemen, he has insulted every president, every celebrity, and every person in the state of New Jersey. He is, without question, the most dangerous man in American show business. Please welcome the one, the only, Mr. Don Rickles." 300 people on their feet before Don cleared the curtain. The anticipation was physical, the specific electricity of a room that knows exactly what kind of night it's about to have. Don walked out from behind the curtain. He looked at the prop near the entrance. The audience leaned forward, already beginning to laugh in anticipation of the first bit. Don walked past it without a word. The first laughs died in people's throats. Don crossed the stage the way a man crosses when he is carrying something that requires his full attention. Slowly, without stopping for the audience, without the bit, without anything except the walk to the desk. He sat down. He looked at Johnny. Johnny looked back at his oldest friend in show business and sat completely still, not the warm professional readiness of a host. Something else, something more exposed. The face of a man who already knows what is coming and has decided to receive it instead of manage it. The studio was quiet in a way it had never been quiet during a Don Rickles appearance. 20 seconds passed. Then 30. Then 40. The orchestra went quiet on instinct, the way musicians do when the temperature of a room shifts beneath them and the rhythm of performance no longer fits. Don reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the folded document. He set it on Johnny's desk between them. Neither man touched it. "I found something today," Don said. His voice was level, completely level. "Something I wasn't supposed to find." Johnny was very still. 14 pages, Don said, going back to 1959. The audience didn't understand yet, but something in the register of his voice was reaching them. Something in the quality of what hadn't happened yet. The 45 seconds without a single joke was telling every person in that room to stop expecting what they expected and start paying attention to what was actually happening. "I have spent 20 years thinking I made it on my own," Don said. His voice held on the first half of the sentence and cracked, barely, on the word own. Just enough for the people nearest the stage to feel it physically before their minds registered it. 20 years believing I found the door and pushed it open myself. 20 years carrying that story as the whole truth of how I got here. He paused. He looked at the document on the desk. "It was you, Johnny. All of it. Every door that opened when I thought it opened on its own. Every call that seemed to come from nowhere. Every room that said yes when I couldn't understand why." His voice thickened. "It was you the whole time." Johnny Carson closed his eyes. The woman in the third row pressed both hands over her mouth. "I never told you about October of 1958, Don said. His voice had dropped now, lower than his performing voice, lower than any sound most people in that room had ever heard from that particular source. "The Fontainebleau, the night I had decided. I was in the back corridor, jacket off, decision made, peace made. You knocked on that door. You said 2 sentences. And those 2 sentences were the only reason I walked back out onto a stage the next night." His voice broke completely. Then, not a crack, a break, clean through the middle of 40 years of armor. "And then you spent 20 years making sure I never had to face another empty room alone, without saying one word to me. Not one. Not once." He looked directly at Johnny. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you ever just tell me?" The silence was 43 seconds by the production record. An eternity on any television, anywhere, at any time. Johnny Carson looked at his desk. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat and still. When he opened his eyes and turned to face Don directly, Gary Wilkes, in camera position, 9 years on The Tonight Show, would tell his wife that night that he had never seen that expression on Johnny's face. He said it was the face of a man being truly known by someone for the first time. "Because it wasn't about me, Don," Johnny said. His voice was quiet and completely certain. The voice of something that had been true for a long time and had never needed to be spoken to, remain true. It was about the room. It was about those 22 million people who needed to laugh. He paused. You gave them that. I just made sure you got the chance. Don Rickles sat across from his oldest friend on live national television and cried, openly, without trying to stop it, without reaching for a joke or a deflection or any of the 40 years of reflexes that had always been available before this moment. Tears running down his face while 300 people and 22 million at home sat in absolute silence and watched. 1 minute and 17 seconds of silence, by the production record. Then Don looked up, and through everything, through the wet face and the broken composure, something moved in his eyes. Something warm and sharp and entirely, irreducibly his own. Something that had never been extinguishable in 40 years of performing, and was not about to be extinguished now. You know what this means, don't you? Don said. His voice was rough and unsteady, and underneath all of that, something tiny and unmistakable was forming. Johnny waited. Everything I have ever said about you on this show, the suits, the ex-wives, the Nebraska business, the haircut, the pencil, all of it. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so private and unperformed that it was almost too intimate for television. He looked directly at Johnny. I owe you every single one of those insults, and I am going to pay you back, every last word, with interest, for the rest of my life. Johnny Carson laughed, the real laugh, not the Tonight Show laugh, the one that only comes when someone he genuinely loves says exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. He laughed with his whole face and his whole body, and with the specific abandon of someone who has been holding something tight for 20 years and has just been given permission to let it go. The studio exploded. 300 people who had come to watch Don Rickles make Johnny Carson laugh were now making each other cry and laugh simultaneously, which is the specific thing that only happens when something true has been said in a room, and the truth turns out to contain both joy and grief in equal measure. And in the middle of all of it, while the laughter rolled through Studio One, Johnny Carson reached across his desk and took Don Rickles' hand. Both his hands wrapped around Don's right hand. He held it on the desk between them. He did not say anything. He did not need to. That was the whole story. Right there in that grip, The Tonight Show ran 21 minutes over its scheduled runtime that night. For the remaining hour, Don and Johnny talked the way they had never talked on camera before. Not the affectionate combat. Something more honest. Something that had been available to them for 20 years and had never been needed until now. Johnny described the Fontainebleau. Walking into the showroom on a whim, watching Don work, understanding within 5 minutes that what he was seeing was a comedian so far ahead of his audience that the distance between them wasn't a failure of performance, but a failure of proximity. He described going back to New York the next day and making the first call. He said it had felt completely natural, obvious, like telling someone there was a fire in a building. You don't consider whether to tell them, you just tell them. Don asked him why he had never said anything. Not once. Not in 20 years. Johnny was quiet for a moment. The studio was very still. Because the moment I told you, it would have become about me, Johnny said. The calls were never a favor. They were just the truth. The truth that you were the funniest person in any room you walked into. You can't take credit for telling the truth. It's just telling the truth. Don Rickles looked at his oldest friend for a long time. You've been doing this my whole career, he said finally. Making it about the truth. That's the job, Johnny said. That's always been the job. They talked about what comedy was actually for. About the people in the dark at home watching a screen when nothing else was working. About the difference between making someone laugh and making someone feel less alone. About the responsibility that comes with having the ability to do either of those things, and what you owe the world when you have it. The switchboard at NBC lit up before the East Coast broadcast had ended. By midnight, every line in the building was busy. Not fans of Don Rickles or Johnny Carson specifically. People who had a person in their lives who had been doing what Johnny had been doing, quietly, without acknowledgement. And people who had never known the full dimensions of what someone had done for them. People who had a list of their own, somewhere, never seen. Mental health organizations across the country reported increases in calls in the 48 hours following the broadcast. Not people in crisis. People who wanted to talk about the invisible things. Veterans groups shared the footage. Family therapists used it in their practices for years. The transcript was reprinted in newspapers from coast to coast. And letters arrived at NBC for weeks afterward, from people who had recognized something in that broadcast that they had been carrying without a name for it. Don Rickles kept the document. He kept it in the inside pocket of that dark navy suit jacket for the rest of his life. The jacket hung in his closet in Los Angeles for 39 years. When his family went through his effects after his death in April of 2017, they found it there. The paper was soft with age, the folds worn smooth. On the cover page, in Don's own handwriting, written beside each of the 314 entries, the same 2 words. He knew, he knew, he knew, 314 times. He had gone through every entry, every name, every date, and confirmed beside each one that the door had opened, that the call had mattered, that the room had happened. And when Johnny Carson's personal effects were organized after his death in 2005, the small wooden box in his home office contained several things. Among them, a 14-page document. On the cover, in Johnny's own handwriting, 5 words. He deserved every single room. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person who was Johnny Carson for you, the one who made a call you didn't know about. The one who said something to someone on your behalf and never told you, because telling you would have made it about them instead of about you. You may never find the list, but somewhere, someone has one with your name on it. Let them know you know. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And drop a comment, telling me where in the world you are watching from. Because this story is reaching people in places I never expected, and I want to know where the truth is landing. Because somewhere right now, someone is making a quiet phone call on your behalf, and they will never tell you unless you find the list.